Hello, I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. This is one of the webinars that we do regularly, and this particular one is one in the Conversations Across Borders series that we're doing to look at global issues and how they affect us all nationally and locally. And what we're planning to do today is look at global justice, and in fact, whether you can have global justice when the world is in crisis, and how you might be able to do that. And in order to do that, we're looking at the two existential crises that are facing us today. One, of course, is climate change. And we know that if we don't make a difference in the next 10 years, then our children and grandchildren will suffer a great deal by the end of this century. And secondly, of course, there is a pandemic of coronavirus that is affecting us all right now, a crisis that is focusing our minds and making us anxious and fearful about how we will come out of this. Well, we're going to talk to someone from Global Justice Now, an organization that was set up specially in order to fight for the world's poor and vulnerable, because they believe that at a time of crisis, it's the poor and the vulnerable who suffer most. And to do that, we have Nick Dearden, who is the director of Global Justice Now. Nick has joined us a couple of times, the House of Commons meeting, and we're really pleased that he's agreed to do this webinar with us today. And to help me, as usual, we have Marina Finetto, who's from Trace Dreams. And with her organization, Trace Dreams, we're finding a number of speakers who want to actually address some of these big issues. And Marina will help me with this interview. Okay, well, let's begin and start this webinar now. And we started by asking Nick to tell us a little bit about himself and the work that he does.
So I have been a campaigner on international issues for many years, maybe even 25 years now, starting out at an organization called War on Want, which you may have heard about, which works especially on workers' rights issues in the Global South. And then I worked for a little bit at Amnesty, working on corporations and their human rights impacts. I then ran a group called Jubilee Debt Campaign, which works on financial reform, and particularly was formed to cancel this enormous buildup of debt in developing world countries. And I took over just as the financial crisis hit. So all of a sudden, finance was very in the news again. So it gave us a lot of work. We had our work cut out there. And then Global Justice Now, where I've been for nearly 6 years, working on a number of issues, but particularly trade and the way that the global economy creates huge injustices in certain parts of the world and certain parts of our society. So one of the big things that we've done in the last few years is to defeat this big trade deal between the US and the European Union, known as TTIP. Which gives a marvelous insight into just how far-reaching and dangerous modern trade deals can be.
Okay, well, I may ask you some more about that later.
Of course.
But Marina, over to you.
Yeah, you are the director of Global Justice Now, as you just mentioned. And I wrote on your website, we are a democratic social justice organization working as part of a global movement to challenge the powerful. Who are the powerful and what would you like to achieve with this organization?
Well, and it might be interesting to know as well, we've been around for 50 years this year. We were supposed to have our 50th anniversary conference last Saturday, actually, but unfortunately we had to transform it into an online seminar because of the crisis. But I mean, right from the beginning, we were formed in a world, I think, which looks in some ways similar to the one we're in now, but in some ways very different. We were in a world where a lot of countries were newly freed from the shackles of empire and were proposing and trying to work towards a form of development which was very exciting, a form of liberating themselves, not just from Western countries, but from the financial system and the corporations that were based in these countries of the West. And we were set up to kind of, as part of a solidarity movement, to support their efforts to make the world fairer and more equal. as time progressed, some of that hope was unfortunately dispelled by some of the very, very harsh economic policies that were put into place in the 1980s and then 1990s by Western countries like the United States and European countries like Britain, through a number of policies, structural adjustment policies they were called at the time, which essentially forced dozens of countries into really serious austerity, had a massive impact on their ability to provide the basics for their people, to run decent healthcare systems, which we're seeing the importance of that now, decent education systems, to be able to control their economy and make their economies work for their people. And instead they were told, no, you've got to follow free market rules. And these free market rules, far from benefiting the countries that they were being imposed upon, were all really about creating conditions that were beneficial for the big corporations and capital based in Western countries like our own. So we see this global economy, the leaders of this global economy, the great beneficiaries of this global economy, if you like, the big corporations, the big financial institutions, as enormous winners over the last 30, 40 years. And they are winners at the expense of both our environment and people in our own society, ordinary people in our own society, but particularly countries that have been prevented from developing and prevented from providing the basics to people in their own countries all around the world. So those are the vested interests we're trying to take on and tackle, because they've created the rules of this economy in their own image, if you like, for their own benefit.
So, I mean, do you think in this world that they have created, the ones who suffer the most are the poor and the vulnerable, and there need to be advocates for that? And is that what your mission is?
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of putting it. There was an idea in the mid-1990s, I think Peter Mandelson in the British government summed this up well, where he talked about he was intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich, as long as people at the bottom weren't getting poorer. And I think that was a fundamental misunderstanding of the way that the economy works. Some people can't get filthy rich without exploiting and extracting from our planet and from other people in the world. There is a relationship there. And what we've seen is a huge growth of inequality over the last 20 or 30 years, which essentially means some people in the world, very large number of people in the world, are relatively much worse off than they would have been before. And they've been forced into a kind of economic system where whether they live or die, the type of life they live is essentially decided by international markets. And we think that's unfair and unjust. And yes, absolutely, we need people speaking up for and acting in solidarity with people around the world who are experiencing that poverty and that injustice if we're to have any chance of solving it and of creating something different.
As they say that poverty has become much better. So we have less poor than we had, for example, 20 years ago. But nevertheless, we have a great growing inequality. And I think that what you are also saying is that we are, of course, all interconnected. This means that we cannot help the South without changing the way we live in the North. How is this interconnections?
Yes, I suppose that's one thing you see most clearly when you start talking about climate change and you look at the fact that we have used so much more of our ecological space, if you like, than we should have done. And what that means is many other countries now are not able to use that ecological space to develop their economies in the way that we did. And by going on and continuing to use more space than we should be using, you know, if you divided all of this, the amount of carbon emissions we could all have on the planet and assigned everybody an amount, we in the West would be massively overusing the amount of carbon emissions that we're really entitled to. And that's having a detrimental impact now on people around the world, people in southern countries and lower income countries being able to develop their economy because they can't use that space, they can't develop in that way. And so the only possible way that we can help and support people who want to develop the necessities that we all enjoy here in their economy is to live differently. is to live differently here. But you can see it in many other ways as well. I mean, look, just the nature of the consumer society we live in. I mean, the amount of resources that are consumed in the West, just, you know, on our computers, on our mobile phones, on whatever it may be, you know, the amount of research capacity that pharmaceutical corporations put into developing you know, cures for baldness, for example, as opposed to, like, you know, diseases that are killing people in the global south now. It all goes to speak to an economy incredibly skewed towards one part of the world and one section of society, because that's where the money is, that's where there is money to be made. And the needs of many people don't count for anything in that system. I think it's really interesting to look back to the post-war period, where my grandparents' generation had come out of a very different sort of economy. Of course, it was a wartime planning economy, and they looked around them and they said, well, hang on, if you can do this in a war, why can't you apply some of those principles to peacetime as well? If the market doesn't work in a crisis, why is there a need to return to market mechanisms for to govern every part of society when we're out of that crisis? And that's why in this country, they created the National Health Service, and in other countries, they created social housing and better education systems and so on. They took parts of society out of market mechanisms because they said, look, it's just too important. These things are too important for the ability to live a dignified life, to enjoy and access your rights and so on. You can't have these things controlled by the market because it creates really unequal outcomes. And yet those lessons were completely ignored when it came to how we advised global south countries to develop, the policies we imposed on them that said, no, you don't need the public sector, you don't need welfare states, you don't need anything like that, the market will provide. Actually, we'd learned those lessons decades and decades before. And the kind of inequality we see in the world now, which is only really comparable to a pre-war, pre-Second World War state of affairs, is reminding us and confronting us with those lessons that we should never have forgotten. Which is, if you just leave stuff to the market, if you just make everything dependent upon a profit motive, there's going to be vast inequalities and vast injustices that are created.
Okay, I mean, so you say that the society we've created, the consumer-based society, does discriminate against the poor. But now we've got these two existential crises facing us, climate change and COVID-19. Do you think that in this period of panic and fear, the poor are in danger of being left out even more than they have been before?
Oh, incredibly so. I mean, I've been doing some work in the last 2 weeks, just looking into the state of health systems in many countries around the world, and they're in an absolutely dire state. I mean, we're struggling here, and we have something like 28 doctors for every 10,000 people in our society. Actually, that's quite low. Britain doesn't do very well in this regard. If you look at Germany, it has something like 42 doctors per 10,000 people. Even fairly well off developing countries like India and South Africa, they're on about eight or nine doctors per 10,000 people. And then you look at really poor countries like Sierra Leone, and they're on less than one doctor per 10,000 people. How on, you know, the number of, there are extremely limited number of intensive care beds and ventilators in a country like Liberia. I mean, almost none. You know, how are these countries supposed to deal with a crisis which is putting the most enormous strain even on our developed health systems? So I'm really worried about that, but I'm also worried not just about the humanitarian crisis, if you like, the health crisis, but the economic crisis that's going to follow and is already, you know, we can already see it, because while countries in the West have the ability to step in and intervene in the market and direct their economy and control the way corporations are allowed to produce and behave in this period, developing countries very often, you know, with some exceptions like China and so on, if you still regard that as a developing economy, very often just do not have those resources. And they don't have those resources because they've been told for the last 30 or 40 years, you don't need those powers, you don't need those tools. Don't worry about it. The market will provide and bring everything that you need, including healthcare. I mean, you know, the way that we currently help developing countries develop their healthcare systems is often to say, let private capital come in and develop it. I mean, we still spend aid money on setting up private hospitals in other parts of the world. And now we see that when, even in the best of times, this can create very unequal outcomes and impacts. But in a crisis, it's a complete disaster because capital is just abandoning those countries. It's coming back to the safety of the financial centers in the United States, Europe and Japan. And those countries are their export markets are collapsing. The price of commodities is collapsing. They're not going to be able to, we can borrow for free essentially at the moment to help us with this crisis. They're not going to be able to borrow at all. South Africa, just last week, its whole economy was junked by the rating agencies. It's not going to be able to borrow at all, or only at very, very high costs. So they're in a very serious humanitarian situation, but also a very, very serious lack of ability to deal with the economic crisis that's coming as a direct result of the way that those economies have kind of been used like guinea pigs far too often over the last few decades.
Okay.
We are indeed seeing, even if you look at Europe, that every country is becoming really nationalist. And so every country is looking for itself, and if it's applied to Europe, how bad it's going to be in poor countries. How do you see? How can we overcome this crisis?
I think that's right. And I think, look, it's really understandable at the moment that people are concerned with their own society, their own economy, their own neighborhood and community. Of course, people are going to be worried about that. And it's something that we absolutely must give enormous attention to, solidarity to people who are suffering in our own society, and call out the government when it's doing things that are a problem. I mean, the austerity in this country and the way that it's kind of undermined vast parts of our NHS, huge problems, and we should be campaigning on that. But we must remember that we also need to campaign on the support and solidarity that the Global South is going to need in the weeks ahead. Thankfully, today, the spread of the disease is a little bit behind Europe, certainly in the sub-Saharan Africa, in sub-Saharan African countries, but it's catching up really fast. There are people who say, look, the weather's a little bit different there. People are much younger. There's an average age of about 19, I think, in sub-Saharan Africa. Maybe they'll be able to weather it better. This really doesn't take into any account at all the very serious diseases that are already prevalent, that are going to potentially mean that it's much more difficult for people to survive coronavirus, and also the appalling state of the health systems, which I've already spoken about. So we need absolutely enormous funding packages. But still, given the stimulus package that we've already seen in Britain, that we've already seen in the United States and other European countries, we're still not talking about packages on that level, but we are still talking about, unprecedented amounts of funding that we need to see flowing to the developing world.
Yeah, but how do you convince people of that? Because coronavirus, climate change, it creates fear, it creates apprehension, and people begin to look to themselves. I know we've seen lots of volunteers and a lot of altruistic things happening, but when the crunch comes, they may look to themselves when the resources are short, when they're in fear. How do you overcome that? How do you say we have to get global justice?
I think there's two ways to do it. I mean, I think there's the way that we've always tried to do, which is by actually trying to insert the voices of people suffering into the political debate here, into the news agenda here, because of course it's a long way away. People don't think about things a long way away that they don't hear about very much until you personalize it, until you actually begin to explain what people are living through. And organizations like mine have always tried to do this. But look, there's some self-interest here as well. I mean, if this crisis has shown us anything, it's that to some degree, we are only as safe as the poorest and most vulnerable members of our society. And our society now encompasses the whole world. That's what the global economy means. I mean, we're seeing it in our own society, right? I mean, why is the fact that not everybody can take the measures that I'm lucky enough to be able to take, and stay at home and not travel on the tube and so on, is a result of the fact that a lot of people don't have sick pay. They're on 0 hours contracts. In the United States, it's even worse. People don't have health insurance. They don't have any right to sick pay whatsoever. Those people are spreading the virus because they're not able to take measures that I'm able to take. Therefore, the spread of the virus in my society from people who don't have the same rights or privileges as I've got is affecting me. And we're going to see this on a global level. I mean, how on earth can we contain the virus in Europe if it spreads like wildfire in Africa? Because you just can't you won't be, we've already seen you can't contain it in one country. It's going to spread. So we absolutely have a self-interest in helping other countries to contain this virus as well, quite apart from the fact that it's completely morally repellent, of course, to just say, well, let them die because they're poor. But I also think we've got to bring in the fact that actually it's often our leaders, it's often the way that our financial systems behaved, it's often the way that our corporations have behaved that has left many of these countries in the kind of weak and vulnerable state that they're in. So therefore we have a responsibility and a duty.
Okay.
You have campaigned on different topics and taking, of course, different ways to challenge the powerful. Also, trade, corporate courts, migration, pharmaceutical, climate, energy, food. What is, in your opinion, the most relevant point right now?
That's an interesting question. I mean, you're right. We try and take a really big picture view by looking at the trends in the global economy, who rules are created to benefit, and so on, and then kind of transforming that into something hopefully that a lot of people in society can grasp, and that doesn't feel too overwhelming and big. So at the moment, as soon as the crisis hit, I mean, we've been working on the problem with the pharmaceutical sector for quite a long time now, for several years now, looking at the way that the pharmaceutical sector, because of international trade rules that were developed in the mid-90s, many big pharmaceutical corporations really don't spend very much time researching new drugs, let alone the kind of drugs and medicines that vast numbers of people that would cure the conditions that vast numbers of people suffer from in the developing world, like tuberculosis and so on. We spend very little money on those kind of drugs because there's no money to be made in. And actually what big pharmaceutical corporations do is they sit on the kind of patents, the long-term patents that they're awarded when they develop a new drug, and they just make money on. They sit back and make money off that, and they market these drugs, and they spend time trying to work out how to replace the patents when they've run out by just making tiny changes to things that they've already created. And so it's a completely dysfunctional system. And already before this crisis, you could already see that in the way that antibiotic resistance is building up, right? I mean, our entire modern medical system depends upon antibiotics, right? The cure for so many diseases depends upon them, but we're becoming resistant to them, and we're not inventing any new ones, and we're not inventing any new ones because pharmaceutical corporations have no interest. They wouldn't make enough money off those new backup antibiotics, so one hasn't been created for years and years and years now, hasn't been discovered for years and years and years now. Big problem, right? Okay. And then it comes to coronavirus, and you see this absolutely writ large, like this is going to affect all of us, because at the moment, of course, we're doing all we can to contain the virus and to look after people who are suffering and who are ill and getting them the treatment they need. But long term, we need a vaccine. That's the thing that we're pinning our hopes upon. However, the thing that we're really concerned about is the pharmaceutical industry will take loads of public money. There's tons of public money going into millions and millions and millions going into the development of these vaccines. They will then patent a vaccine, because this is how it happens, this is how the system works, and they will charge an absolute fortune for people to get access to those vaccines. And of course, who's going to be the last people in the world to get hold of these vaccines? It will be people living in the poorest countries, because they don't have enough leverage in the global system. So here you come to a situation where people can really understand, really grasp the need for a vaccine. We all need this now. And you can then begin to trace back, well, what might be an obstacle to you getting this vaccine? What might be an obstacle to us treating people in the world? And it's actually trade rules. It's actually the way the global economy works and the way that it treats big pharmaceutical corporations. And using that, you can then begin to get people engaged in a campaign for change to those rules. For example, the thing we're calling for at the moment is the British government, in all of the public money it puts into researching coronavirus treatments, needs to put strict conditions on that money to say a corporation can't just patent this stuff that gets developed and run away with it and sit on that patent for 20 years and profiteer from it.
But we are seeing regarding the vaccination or vaccine right now is that there are many open sources, and they've started sharing a lot. And this is, I think, a really positive aspect on this. And also, there are also positive aspects that are going on in this moment. And as I understood, but food also a really important aspect right now. How we produce food, how we distribute food, and how we...
Very, very important. I mean, if anything, I mean, food is increasingly controlled by big agricultural corporations and produced on an industrial scale. And many people think, well, we've got a very complex society. There's lots of people in the world. We have to have it like this in order to get enough food. It's not really the case. And there's been lots of studies done showing that actually, if you produce stuff on a smaller scale, not only would it create more jobs in the agricultural industry and give people more power over the work that they do, but it would also actually provide safer food security in the long term. I mean, actually, one of the reasons we think why coronavirus made the leap from animals to humans may well be connected with the industrial scale farming that we've been practicing for many, many years now. And even if it isn't, it surely will do in the future. I mean, this is surely an issue which is going to come back to bite us in a very big way. So absolutely, this is an opportunity for us to begin thinking about the food system that we've got, to begin thinking, this idea that actually you don't need to grow food in a country like Britain anymore. You can just rely on Africa to produce all of your food because they can do it more cheaply and you can import it, and we can concentrate on creating financial services or whatever we do to sell back to Africa for that food. This has been a disaster, and in a situation like this, you really see how you need food security. Now, I'm not talking about complete self-sufficiency of countries or anything like this, but clearly the balance has been tipped so far away from having any kind of security or protection in your own economy that it's frightening when something like this hits us. It's really frightening, and in some ways, the virus may be a wake-up call that the way that we've run the world economy up to now doesn't protect us, doesn't give us any security or safety. It actually exposes us to huge vulnerabilities. And if it's exposing us to those vulnerabilities, what's it doing to people who don't have the kind of social welfare, the social structure, the economic structures that prevent them falling into real poverty?
Okay, you've been talking about the deficits and dysfunctions in society that discriminate against the poor, and you've been doing this much in the context of the coronavirus. Climate change is going to make it even worse, isn't it?
It is. And do you know what? I mean, the only thing I hope is that, and it's awful because, so many people are going to suffer and unfortunately die as a result of this crisis. But we are coming to a point where far, far more people are going to die as a result of climate change. And the only thing that I hope is that this virus gives us this kind of wake-up call, that we're living in a very unsustainable global economy and we need to take serious action to avert complete catastrophe for human beings, full stop, for our life on this planet. And the thing that I hope is, we've already started seeing it. We've started seeing governments who preach the free market and preach the idea that governments shouldn't intervene in the international economy. We've seen them taking absolutely extraordinary action over the last 2 weeks. We've seen them intervening in the markets. We've seen them controlling their economy. In the United States, like one of the most deregulated free market economies, we've now seen a president who really didn't want to do this begin to direct industry about what they should be producing. So very serious levels of economic control, wartime levels of economic control. What I hope is, when the crisis starts subsiding and we have bigger discussions about all this, people will start saying, well, actually, you could do it. You could do it when you needed to do it. When there was an acute reason to do it, you were able to take these activities. There is a long-term chronic reason to do it, and that's climate change. Climate change requires us to begin restructuring the international economy in a very fundamental way. It requires governments to start taking really serious action. The money that we're going to be pouring into corporations, because otherwise they will go under as a result of this crisis. This needs to come with strings attached. We need to not repeat what we did in 2008 after the financial crisis and just kind of pump money into the economy and let banks do whatever they wanted with it, which inflated bubbles and debt and all sorts of things. We need to put strings on it to say, okay, we'll consider the bailout of this industry. Might be related to fossil fuels, might be an airline or whatever, but you cannot continue running in the way that you're running now.
The trouble is, you might say that, and we need international cooperation, we need to do things differently, but we've seen the growth of my country first populism.
Yeah.
So there's a counter culture growing as well. And so you have an uphill struggle, don't you? How are we going to counter that?
Well, it's a really good question. And look, I'm not saying everything's just, let's all sit back, everything's just going to be fine. I totally get I mean, in some ways, we have never had, certainly in the post-war period, we've never had a period where international cooperation is this difficult before, because you have leaders like Trump, like you've got people like Bolsonaro, you've got people like Modi, who are going to try to use this to whip up nationalism, xenophobia, populism, and all the rest of it. And who knows, you know, that could create really very, very serious political situations in certain countries and in the world at large. We saw before the Second World War the rise of fascism, which was partly, of course, a product of the very vulnerable, unstable and unequal economy that existed at that time, that in some ways mirrors the economy that we've got now. So it's a threat. I don't deny that at all. But I suppose, you know, as campaigners, we always feel a bit up against it. You know, we always feel it would take quite a lot to be able to achieve what we need to achieve here to create the kind of better world that we want to see, a sustainable and peaceful world and all the rest of it. Sometimes, even against all of the odds, it takes a crisis for people to really begin thinking about that kind of big change. And this is certainly a crisis, and we've got to make every attempt, we've got to use every opportunity that we've got to argue for things, big reform, big cooperation, big coordination to make things better rather than worse. What's going to happen in the US? We don't know. We don't know if it's going to, I can see this most definitely completely undermining Donald Trump and its election year. So who knows? I mean, when people actually start to realize that a lot of what he was saying and what Fox News was saying and whatever was complete rubbish, and that actually his lack of action has cost, you know, thousands and thousands of lives unnecessarily, who knows what that might create? And we've got to be there making those arguments, I think, and making those points and pointing people towards a more hopeful solution. Okay. You know, when people are frightened, they often need that. They need optimism. They need hope. They need to know there's a way out. And for us to be able to explain that is a really important function at this time. Okay.
And so I received recently a video made in Italy. You know, Italy is really suffering right now, and there was like a little bit a video to make us laugh, and it was like in 1 month we managed to solve the problem that we had with no digitalization in schools, no digitalization in universities. We managed to stop letting people flying around the world. So we manage a lot of things. And he was a little provocative. He said, now we have to cope only with Corona. But on the other hand, I see in Italy, the mood is really bad. If it is about Europe. So what is happening in Europe is really a dangerous situation, as if I see this from an Italian perspective. And yesterday or 2 days ago in Sweden, where I'm based, in a transmission they said, now we believe that the EU is going to be stronger after this crisis, like you said, after a crisis. But in Italy, there are really a lot of intellectual people also really that were really for Europe. They are asking, do we need Europe? So my question is, what do you think? Are we going to get more the positive aspects with change? It is a progressive change in many things, or these negative aspects? What is the future of Europe and of the international community?
The tensions that you've described are extreme, and it changes every day. You know, in some ways, this is a time where we need the kind of coordination and cooperation that being in a union, the European Union, which sadly we're no longer in, can provide. However, many of the especially the very powerful Northern European countries are falling back on nationalistic measures, and there is it's a genuine lack of solidarity that's being shown towards the Mediterranean countries that are suffering the most extensively and acutely from this, in exactly the same way we saw the Eurozone crisis play out 8 years ago. It was exactly the same. There were some countries that were very happy to take the benefits of the European Union's economic model, but weren't happy to then provide the transfers that you need to be able to provide if you're kind of seeing this as you should be able to do in a country, we should be able to do in the United States or whatever. So it was kind of like, we'll take the benefits, but we'll leave you to suffer the consequences without any help. It seems to me that in the last few days, there has been some movement. I mean, initially, Germany and France, for example, put export restrictions on ventilators and so on. And you kind of think, well, okay, I understand you need those ventilators. You're also going through a crisis. But if this is supposed to be a single economic unit, you can't simply keep, there's a need over here and you need to help people who are experiencing that need. I would argue you need to help people even if they're not in the European Union, but certainly if you're in a single economic bloc, it's absolutely vital. The European Commission has tried to intervene to smooth out some of those tensions, but really, I mean, when the EU leaders met last week, I mean, I thought the pleas from the leadership of the Italian and Spanish governments were heart-wrenching. I mean, it was awful, and they were saying, you're tearing at the fabric of this project here. You know, we don't know if it will survive if you don't step up and actually start to behave like you have some solidarity with us. So I completely agree with you, and I don't know which way it's going to go. I think it is time, it's long past time for the European Union to show that it can show solidarity with its members. We had this 10 years ago. It's well past time now, and this is going to be the crisis that challenges the European Union like no other. And it's either going to have to step up and show that it can operate in a different way, or it will collapse. And I don't hold out any, I'm not somebody who thinks, yeah, it's all going to have to collapse before we can start again and everything's going to be fine. I think it will be very serious if it collapses. On the other hand, if it really can't live up to the promises made, the project as a whole and what it's supposed to stand for, what can you say? Okay. So I hope it does. I mean, there are very good proposals at the moment for the issuing of Eurobonds to help Italy and Spain deal with this crisis. At the moment, Germany and the Netherlands are not keen on this at all because they're worried about their long-term reputations for fiscal purity and so on. You know, we've got to get rid of all this. This is ridiculous. We need to issue these things now. We need to help these countries because they're going to need massive fiscal space.
Yeah, we sort of come up, well, we've gone over our half an hour, which is great because we could have gone on forever and ever. I mean, there are lots of questions to ask, but maybe we could end by just asking you, do you see any ray of sunshine? Do you see any hope in the future? And finally, just to say, and both briefly, if people wanted to get involved with what you're doing, how do they make contact?
Right. So briefly, I do see a ray of hope, and I see it from two sources. First of all, the realization that we can't just isolate ourselves from the global society that we live in, and coronavirus has shown that very, very clearly. And that unless we're prepared to think about a more equal world, we are vulnerable. You know, we can't insulate ourselves from these vulnerabilities. And the second thing, as I've said, is the kind of action that's being taken now by Western countries. You can't then go back to the rest of the world and say free market principles are sacrosanct, international trade and international markets are going to provide you with everything you need. You can't go back and say that because it's clearly not the case. Your own policies give a complete and utter stark lie to that way of thinking. And so it may well be that the tools that those countries take on are exactly the tools we need to develop and use in order to bring about a completely new model for international cooperation and how we manage our economy. So those are two rays of hope, and I think it's, as I say, because this has happened before some of what we fear climate change may be bringing to us in the future. Perhaps this will be the wake-up call that we desperately needed anyway. I'm not saying...
How do they contact you?
And that's where the activism comes in, right? Because none of this is going to change just by us sitting back and doing nothing. how we behave, how we campaign, what we say is going to be so vital in deciding which way this goes. And so please have a look on our website, globaljustice.org.uk. There are two very high profile campaigns we're running at the moment, one on reforming the pharmaceutical system, one on the emergency aid, particularly debt cancellation that's needed by many countries in the global south. I know everyone's going to be thinking about their friends, their families and their local communities, but spare some time as well to think about this big global picture because it's so important in how we go forward.
Okay, well, thanks, Nick. I mean, that was a really, really great interview. And it is the sort of debate we should be having because we're going to get past this crisis. And if we don't talk about it now and into the time we get past it, then, you know, we're not going to be equipped to deal with it in the way that you talked about. So I think it's been really, really useful. So thank you. And thank you, Narina, for taking part in it and adding all the things that you have as well. And, you know, we will obviously hopefully talk to you again sometime in the future. But thank you for doing this. And we'll end this interview now.